You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on this.
All right, well, after some video technical problems, we are actually live. Sorry about that, everyone. You know, maybe I should just get a producer. Anyway, yeah, trying to produce your own videos or live streams, not always easy. You screw things up a lot. But I want to say, hey, welcome to the chat, everybody. This is an unusually scheduled stream, but that is because my guest had to, I have to work around my guest's schedule, and he just couldn't make it for the normal slot that I do for these, which is Saturday. So instead, Saturday is going to be a video premiere, and that is going to be September 12th, 2020, if you're watching this in the future. So if you're watching this right now, now you know. And Cain, why don't you introduce yourself? Okay, now, is that because of an investigation of young Earth creationism and deciding that it was inaccurate? Or is that just because that was never what was presented to you, or... Oh, wait, apparently they can't... Did I screw this up? I'm sorry. See? I screwed it up. Could you repeat that? I'm sorry, Cain.
We're live now?
Yeah, I was always live, but unfortunately I, once again, flubbed it and forgot to unmute you.
Okay. Well, I'm Cain Wilson, that's my alias, and I've never been a young Earth creationist, just haven't. I graduated high school about 16, and it's a few years after that right now. My education has always been more for being able to find the answers rather than memorize them. So that's kind of how I treat life.
Well, I will agree that in most of life, it's important to know how to get the right answer, not necessarily to know the right answer right off the bat. Yeah, you find that out very quickly. It's like, it's not so important that you have everything memorized, but if you know where to get all the information, if you know like which books or which resources or whatever will have the information, that is definitely the right way to go. But I want to reiterate my question from earlier. Had you looked at the young Earth creationist claims and then rejected them? Or is this, like, what experience do you have with different forms of creationism?
Well, scripturally, it right off, basically as soon as the ideas of young Earth creationists were introduced to me, they didn't seem to match scripture to me.
Okay.
So it never really seemed as an option.
Okay. So, I guess my next question that I would ask is, what do you actually picture as the history of the universe and Earth, and then specifically like life on Earth? Like, how did the universe, about how long ago, and in what manner do you think that the universe kind of went from whatever initial state it might have had and got to its current state?
Well, as far as like the age, I defer to the experts that say that the planets, the way their trajectory is right now and their velocity would be about 13 to 14 or 15 even billion years ago.
Okay.
As far as the Earth, that's something I'm still looking into personally, but it would not be hard for me to say just it's 4 billion years old.
Okay. Well, the reason I want to ask these questions is because, well, I find that a lot of times young Earth creationists are very clear, at least on what they perceive the history of the universe and Earth to be. I have a little less success trying to figure out exactly what various old Earth creationists think about the same topics, and so that's why I ask. And so, so at some point, Earth is a thing 4.5-ish billion years ago, and you're not sure how that happens, but would you say that the Nebular Hypothesis, which is the current mainstream idea behind solar system formation, is unlikely, or would you find that reasonably plausible, or do you just not have the information to assess?
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is there's always going to be new ideas of the little details, but generally, yeah, what the experts have right now is basically my best guess too.
Okay. So, Nebular Hypothesis seems reasonably likely, is probably what
Yeah.
I'm getting there. Okay. That's fair. Now, I think where you might start to be diverging from what is the current scientific consensus is, now there isn't really a scientific consensus on the formation or the creation of the first life. So I'm willing to just accept for this discussion that God can and has created life, because I don't have a good model for the formation of the first life to put forth, so I'm not going to. I also am not super well versed in it, so I'm willing to go there. But you reject common ancestry to a certain degree. So, what does the creation of life look like through the history of the Earth? So, let's say we just got to the say the Archean, right? And now we're getting the first stromatolite fossils. Why are we getting stromatolite fossils? Did God create stromatolites? Did stromatolites evolve? What's going on there?
I'm not very familiar with the
All right, well, we can skip
geology
ahead.
part of it, but
We can skip ahead a bit, because not too many people know much about I don't know that much about stromatolites. But let's say we get to, say, the Cambrian, right? Are you familiar with the Cambrian period, where we've got all those weird creatures like Anomalocaris and Hycuichthyes and all that?
I'm fairly familiar.
Okay.
It's not been any of my
Well, I
study
guess
focuses or anything.
rather than, then I'll take a step back. Rather than focus on a particular time period and what's going on. So, are you familiar with the concept of faunal succession?
Uh, for what exactly?
So faunal succession is it's one of those, it's sort of a brute fact of paleontology that as you go up through the stratigraphic column, the organisms filling the environment change going vertically, right? So what organisms were present even in a similar environment, say like let's say you have a desert or you have a tropical rainforest or whatever in several different environments, as you go vertically through the stratigraphic column, which animals and plants you find there changes. So at one point, very low down, you don't really have anything on land except for very tiny plants, and then eventually you get a few arthropods like insects. Then you go a little bit higher and you get some things you would call amphibians, although they're not technically amphibians. But then you start getting things that are things like not quite mammals, but they're sort of mammal-like. And then you get some reptilian things that aren't quite lizards or dinosaurs or crocodiles, but they're looking a bit like it. Then you get a bit higher and you get mostly dinosaurs as the dominant megafauna. You get a little bit higher and the dinosaurs start to, or they don't just start, they abruptly go away as the dominant megafauna and they start being replaced by mammals, and so on. And that is faunal succession. Basically, at different times in Earth's history, if you were to take a snapshot of life on Earth, it would look very different at different times. Is that
Right.
How is it that this is coming about in terms of old Earth creation?
Well, it I'm not exactly a choice specimen of a old Earth creationist necessarily. I do kind of enjoy a few of the conspiracy-like parts of young Earth creationists, but not quite to that extent. As far as final succession, I believe that is uh, fairly reliable.
Okay.
There might be a few instances where it's bent at times, but not exactly ever broken.
So, what is so you don't believe that all these new organisms are the result of evolution, or do you?
Right.
Oh, you don't. Okay. So, is God throughout geological time simply creating new organisms?
That is my current hypothesis, yes.
Okay. All right. So, I wanted to try to piece out what we're so say way back in the Jurassic, God just hadn't created rabbits yet. That's why there weren't any.
Okay.
I'm trying to. Is that an accurate assessment?
Um, like, is that what I'm
Right.
thinking?
Is that what you would agree with?
Um, yeah, probably.
Okay. So I guess then what I want to say, and I know you have a little presentation. I'm not sure how easy it's going to be for you to give it because you're having some. We're having some technological problems with trying to use only mobile devices for this, so it's a little tricky. But do you want to go into that presentation now that I think I have a reasonable grasp on what, and the audience has a reasonable grasp on what your idea about the history of the Earth is, especially life?
Um, I think we could discuss a little bit more. I don't think it's
Okay. So,
quite clear what my viewpoint is.
well, why don't you
It does seem a little vague to myself even at this point.
well, do you have any? What else would you like to add to try and clarify that?
Well, I'd like to ask a general question.
Oh, absolutely.
For your definition of a miracle, what would that be technically?
Um, so first I want to say for 299, Scott Duke says, great topic and discussion, Dapper Dino. Thank you very much, Scott Duke. I really appreciate that. And to answer your question, I would say that if a miracle were to occur, it would have to be the way you would recognize it would be an event that is not explainable under the normal operation of the universe as it has been observed to be operating. So, for instance, if you encountered a cold fire, we have a lot of scientific history and knowledge about things like thermodynamics, chemistry. We can break this down all the way down to like the quantum level as to what's going on. But if for some reason we had a fire, which by every single physical law that we can apply to it should be emitting heat, it were for some reason absorbing it, I think we could reasonably call it a miracle because we have a very robust system of science describing how those things act, and it is violating that. I don't know that there would be any other way to recognize a miracle.
Okay. Would you say that there's likely a scientific reason for that to be opposite of what you'd think it would be?
I don't know of any physical reason why that could happen. It would be that particular example would violate basically everything that we know about physics.
Right.
So I
Okay.
couldn't think of a good scientific explanation for it that would be consistent with any previous observations. So that is the kind of thing I would expect were a miracle to be proposed and then demonstrated to actually have been something at least unusual. Now, I guess it's possible that the explanation could simply be that we don't have sufficient physics, but I'll be honest, something like that, something that obviously violated numerous laws of physics in a way that was essentially inexplicable, I I would be very willing to entertain the idea that that would have been a miracle.
Okay. Well, personally, I just uh, from my understanding of the reported miracles in the Bible,
Mhm.
it kind of seems to me like if you were to look far enough, you would find a scientific explanation. Uh, sort of like if I moved a cup across the table, if someone wasn't there to see it, well, they'd see the cup just move from one place to the other without an explanation. But I kind of view the idea of a miracle as kind of odd, as it would be contrary to what you think of the natural world, when it might actually be the most natural thing to expect. I don't know if that makes any sense.
So, if something that would be the opposite of what's predicted were to happen?
Was that a question?
Yeah, I'm trying to see if that's an accurate parsing of your definition.
Um, Basically, if there's something that would require direct interaction with something, uh, which is actually not a miracle. If you move your water to the other side of the table, that's not a miracle.
Right.
It's I define uh, generally the term miracle as a use of science to the maximum capability.
I'm not sure I follow. A use of science to the
Well,
maximum capability?
um, yeah, as far as your technical advancement,
Okay.
it's it might be a miracle to one person, but completely normal to another.
So,
Uh,
are you going with that
the idea
a
is
miracle is subjective?
sort of, yeah. If my claim is not that God is going to just poof animals or bacteria into existence, but he's going to use the resources there,
Okay.
kind of.
So, wouldn't that include the option of common ancestry?
It could. It very well
But you
could.
don't accept that as the actual mechanism.
I have some serious doubts as to that.
Okay. All right. So, I think that is where I would like to start really asking some more questions then is about the common ancestry because um most I mean I find it hard to find anyone who doesn't accept some amount of common ancestry. So for instance, most creationists would say that all humans share common ancestry.
Right.
So
Well, they do.
well, I mean, yes, I agree. There are no humans who do not share ancestry with the rest of Homo sapiens. But so let's try to do something that we tried to do the first time that we spoke, where it didn't really work out because of a very poor connection. But so genus Canis is the genus that includes the wolf and the dog and several other species. Do you think the wolves and dogs share a common ancestry? And by
I
by
believe
dogs, I
so.
mean okay. So now, what if we expand that out? So we get the other Canis species, like Canis aureus, the golden jackal, Canis latrans, the coyote. Which, by the way, again, any of the young Earth creationists who are watching, stop following Kent Hovind and calling the coyote Canis coyotes. That's wrong. It's Canis latrans. Fix it. Or Canis rufus, the red wolf of the southeastern United States. So do you think it likely that all of these organisms, all of whom actually can successfully reproduce fertile offspring, share common ancestry?
Yes.
Okay. Now, What about, say, genus Canis and genus Vulpes, which is the genus containing most of the things that people call foxes?
Probably.
Okay. Why does your confidence go down?
I'm not sure as to why it. I don't know.
Okay. Well, what?
It's kind of like if I was to say that all the apes were to share a common ancestor, that personally, I'd say it's likely that orangutans are a separate uh, thing from gorillas and chimps, but I'm not certain if gorillas and chimps are separate from each other.
Well,
Currently.
okay. So I guess we'll back up to genus Canis, where you are fairly confident. So you would give a yes as to common ancestry for genus Canis.
Right.
On what do you base that assessment? What makes you think that they have a common ancestor?
The compatibility for breeding is actually the primary thing that I would use.
Okay. So would you say that organisms which share common ancestry with each other simply cannot diverge to the point that they are no longer capable of producing offspring together?
Like that they can't.
Right. So two organisms, they share a common ancestry, but they have since diverged to the point that they no longer can breed together. They cannot produce offspring.
Well, as far as speciation goes, it's very interesting because you could lose, for instance, one individual may lose reproductive organs. So yes, it does fall outside of being able to reproduce. But
well, I mean, let's say you have two groups of organisms, both of whom share common ancestry, right? So like, we'll use the example like we did earlier with Canis, with the Canis genus, right? So Canis aureus and Canis latrans have no real possibility of breeding with each other because one lives primarily in Africa and the Middle East, and the other one lives primarily in Central and South. Actually, I guess now it's spreading all the way into like Canada, but whatever. Canis latrans lives in North America primarily, and so outside of humans bringing them together, Canis latrans and Canis aureus are just not going to meet. Now, if we ignore potential gene flow possibilities with Canis lupus, which is unlikely, but I guess slightly less unlikely than direct crossing, we'll just take that out of the mix for now. Do you think that in the future it could be the case that even though now those two species are capable of producing offspring, that they could cease to be able to reproduce across that line while remaining fertile within their local population?
yes, I do.
Okay. So
Primarily for just incompatibility reasons.
right.
Eventually, that's going to come up.
Okay. Well, so that then makes the lack of ability to reproduce a troublesome criterion, right? Because we can say, if you can reproduce with something, you do share common ancestry. That's fair. I don't know of anyone who would say that there are organisms that can reproduce but don't share common ancestry. Or sorry, reproduce with each other that don't share common ancestry. But what it also means is that inability to reproduce doesn't mean a lack of common ancestry. So you have to come up with a different criterion on which to judge that two groups are no longer related. So if you suspect that Vulpes and Canis aren't related, it can't be because you can't make natural Canis Vulpes hybrids. So what other reason might there be for someone to say that Vulpes, which, I mean, foxes have a lot of anatomical, genetic, behavioral similarities to, wolves, jackals, coyotes, and dogs, right?
Right.
So what is it about them that makes it seem less likely that they have common ancestry with wolves, than it does with within Canis.
I'm not exactly sure. That's the the best way currently to suggest a kind would be to first rule in all of those that can currently breed together. But there either is or there isn't something that we're not currently able to take note of that would separate them, uh, whether it be there or further up the tree.
So, what I'm hearing is that your current contention is that I'm just going to say I hate having to say Canis genus. So I'm just going to say wolves. We're just going to lump Canis into wolves, just so I don't have to see genus Canis all the time. So what I'm hearing you say is that wolves and foxes don't share common ancestry because you kind of feel like they don't, and hopefully at some point something will be discovered about them that will demonstrate this.
Well, I'm not against them having common ancestry, but at some point, a person would have to put their foot down. But
okay,
at the
well
same time,
let's see where
not
that
exactly certain.
let's see where that point might be. How about other canids? Because Canidae is a family, right? It contains a lot more than just foxes and wolves. So
Right.
it's also got in there genus Kuon, which is the dhole of the Southwest Asia and the Indian subcontinent, which is definitely a canid, but it has rounder ears than most other canids. It also has a different number of nipples and a different dental formula. I believe it's that it has an extra molar past what most other canids have. Is that a potentially related group to the group of foxes and wolves?
Is there like subspecies under that too? Like
Well, yes, genus Kuon contains, I believe, 2 species, and I think at least one of them has a few subspecies, but please don't quote me on that.
okay. So that seems likely to have a common ancestry with
Okay.
other canids, but at the same time, I'm not gonna say for sure, and I admit that's kind of rude of me, but
I mean, it's better than lying and saying yes or no without having actually formed that. So what I want to do is try to get to the point where we say no. Okay, so let's go as far outside as I can while still keeping in Canidae, right? Lycaon pictus is the African painted dog. It is about as far outside of the rest of Canidae as it is possible to be. They share significantly less common anatomy, behavior, and genetics with the rest of Canidae. And also, they're almost gone. So, hey, guys, go save the African painted wolves, because that would be a sad day when there are no more painted wolves in, or painted dogs, or whatever you want to call them, in Africa. But anyway, do you think that that group could be related to the rest of Canidae?
Possibly.
Okay.
That's something that I'm personally a little bit apprehensive to talk about because at least my translation that I primarily use speaks of not just kinds but also sorts. So potentially, I may be looking at groups within each kind. I'm not
Okay.
exactly sure, but still working on that.
I do want to do one thing. So normally I try to leave the questions that we get asked for my guest towards about the last half hour or so. Although we do have a super chat, so if you'd like, you can answer that pretty quickly. But then I want to get back to that conversation, or if you'd like, we can leave it until the end. And of course, when it comes to question and answer time, super chatted questions are at the top of the line. Would you prefer to answer it now or save it till like the last half hour or so?
Let's go ahead.
Okay, so Eric Vertaler 92 for $4.99 US asks, what are your thoughts on Behemoth and Leviathan? And also asks, are people leaving Christianity because of YEC, or Young Earth Creationism?
Okay, so the first one, my thoughts on Behemoth and Leviathan. I would so love for there to be dinosaurs still alive,
There are.
but I mean, like
Ones that aren't birds?
non-avian dinosaurs.
Fair enough.
And not just you, Dapper. I realize that you are a non-avian dinosaur, but
All the rest
I'd
of
like
us.
for more.
Yes. But it sounds like it's a no.
Yeah, probably not. I mean, there's some potential, like if you wanted to say the Spinosaurus was Leviathan, I would kind of think that was pretty cool, but I'm not gonna say yay or nay on that.
All right, and do you think that people are leaving Christianity because of YEC?
Some, yeah, and then others no.
Yeah.
It's of course some are, and of course some aren't. But
I would say I've never met anyone who became a Christian after being exposed to Young Earth Creationist material. I've never heard of anyone like that. All I've heard of is I've heard of people who became Christians and then were exposed to Young Earth Creationist material and became Young Earth Creationists. And I've heard people who were already Christians and left because of Young Earth Creationism. I don't think it's causing a mass exodus from Christianity, but I think it is a net negative in terms of numbers for Christianity. I think it is a cause of sort of a trickle of apostasy, if you will.
right, some things are left for each person to test out for themselves, and it's not just for people to not a personal decision to leave young earth creationists as a potential route. There's I don't know, I'm a little surprised that it even came about.
All right. Also, I want to make a quick correction. I had earlier indicated that, as far as I knew, Lacaia Pictus was the sort of the outgroup from the rest of Canidae. It turns out it is Uroscion, which is the gray fox, which is one of those reasons why the word fox is a little bit tricky, because it actually just refers to small canids most of the time. They don't actually form a natural group, but thank you very much for the correction, Just a Walking Fish. That's what I get for going off of my internal memory of canid phylogeny. So, I still want to get to a place where we say no. So,
Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and assume that you probably don't know much about things like borophagines or amphicyonids. Is that a fair guess?
Yes.
Okay.
It is a fair guess.
Don't feel bad. Almost no one does. They are very obscure. All right, so we'll stick to extant animals then. How about a bear? I don't know if you've ever seen a bear skull, but a bear skull is just a big dog skull. And a bear is essentially a dog with no tail that walks plantigrade instead of digitigrade. Or conversely, a dog is a bear with a long tail that walks on its toes. Do you think dogs and bears could be related?
I don't. I mean,
Okay.
They obviously came from the same place, but how you want to get there is...
Well, so the question ultimately is, do all dogs and all bears share ancestry that goes back to a population that was essentially neither a dog nor a bear, but that was still a conoidean carnivore?
I don't think so.
Why? Why is that?
Well, I am going to go with they're just so different.
Okay.
I know that's a not very well-based argument, and I wish it was better, but...
So the reason that it's so different, I don't find like it's a terribly useful answer is because you would need to set up a barrier. You need to set up some reason why common ancestry or why divergence after populations no longer are interbreeding has to have some cutoff. Like you can go this far but no farther. Like what is the genetic thing that acts like Gandalf on the bridge telling the Balrog of evolution that you shall not pass? What's doing that?
Personally, I think it's a number of scenarios that are not able to be certain organisms would not be viable by extension of these different mutations. I just don't see how I don't know. There's like brain size in human evolution is quite often touted, but the relative brain size and brain size to mass and whether the skull will will impede the brain's ability to function. There's a number of variables like that that to me don't seem to fit well together.
Okay, so I think what I'm hearing you get at is that you are there's this problem that creationists sometimes call the inviability of intermediate forms. That going from whatever the ancestor of say bears and dogs are to say bears on one side and then on dogs would result in anatomically non-viable organisms. Is that your claim?
Somewhat, yes. But then you have amphibians, so
Well, so let's
to what extent is an intermediate an intermediate or its own thing?
well, so let's actually dig into the okay, so we have fossils of what mainstream science would consider the karyotype of the common ancestor of dogs and bears. And what a karyotype is basically just this is essentially the anatomy we expect for the common ancestor. And so we can base our ideas about what is the ancestral condition for this group on it as a result of it. There's a whole lot of work that goes into trying to figure out what a karyotypic form would be for the common ancestor of two groups. But
Right.
we have good reason, which I do not have time to get into because it would take several hours, but to think that the common ancestor for dogs and bears that evolution posits would be plantardigrade like a bear. It would probably be something that could climb trees, which is actually fairly trivial. But it was also primarily terrestrial, and it had a long tail and was probably closer in size to, say, a wolf than like a grizzly or something. Right? So,
Right.
What is the problem in going from this organism to a bear, or from that organism to a wolf? What forms of anatomy would occur in that would be, from your perspective, not viable?
Well, for instance, I personally would feel that the morphological features would have to be analyzed and see which ones actually fall in line more with one or the other, or if it
Well,
is its own unique thing in between, or
let's
something like that.
let's pick an easy trait. Okay, so let's say going from having a long tail to having a short tail. You think that's the kind of thing that could evolve?
It potentially.
Okay, so we don't see any
Let me
particular.
revert to that answer. Potentially.
So there's no huge problem in having a tail that gets shorter over generations, as it's less useful and simply prone to injury now. That seems not impossible, right?
Well, right.
I mean, because that's the
Just
only
because most cats have long tails doesn't mean that all cats
right.
have to have long tails.
So
Sometimes it's genetically
Is there any big problem in going from being wolf size to being significantly larger in terms of common ancestry and descent with modification?
So that's potentially an area, because when you're estimating what a form would be like when it's larger, it may be easy to assume that it would be like this other form that you're already seeing. But if it was, I don't know, there's certain things that when you make something, let's just say a St. Bernard, bigger, there's certain things that are going to be functionalities that are
Okay. But you're also aware that when humans made, say, Great Danes or St. Bernards, they started with normal-sized dogs and just rapidly selected for the largest animals they could without any particular concern for the overall viability of the animal. Whereas natural selection, one, takes its time. It doesn't have to go at, breakneck breeding speed. And it also will select out problems caused by, or it will tend to select not simply for size, but also for the anatomy to accommodate size. So that's why we do, in fact, have things that even you think are related. So, for instance, we have tiny foxes, and we have much, much larger wolves. And so it seems like you don't normally think that a change in size is impossible.
Right.
Because even in that change from a fox to a wolf, you do need additional weight supporting capacity. You need to make sure the heart is the right size. You need to make sure that the hips aren't going to get dysplasia, they're formed properly, just going from that one small size to the larger one. And it's the same kind of challenges in going from something the size of a wolf to something the size of, say, a grizzly bear. As natural selection goes, it can do things like make sure that the bones scale properly so that they get thicker a bit faster than they get longer in terms of the evolution of this lineage. You can do things like make the pelvic girdle more robust, make the heart a bit bigger, do things to make the respiration a bit more efficient, like make the lungs a little bit bigger in proportion to the rest of the animal, get that sort of more barrel-chested shape that some bears have so that they can get that bigger lung and heart capacity. None of those are any of those things impossible to evolve?
Well, I mean, those are just simple facts of genetics. Anything that breeds, there's a possibility for it to be big enough or small enough. There's just, it's fairly obvious that one thing can be apparent to a larger thing or a smaller thing.
Okay, so what I guess what it sounds like I'm hearing is you don't have any particular reason to say that an animal like the proposed common ancestor for wolves and bears couldn't evolve into a bear. So if we're going to say that wolves and bears can't be related, we now have to go ahead and say that that means that that animal couldn't evolve into a dog then. So the big change from the common ancestor of wolves and bears going from that ancestor to wolves is essentially the shift in stance from obligate plantigrade to obligate digitigrade. And in digitigrade, it means you're walking on your toes rather than on the heel or the palm, where bears, like humans, walk on their heels, whereas dogs don't. So what about that change is non-viable?
I'm not exactly certain what would be non-viable about it, but I would say that that's likely where I'd kind of say probably not related.
Okay. Well, you're aware that you, in fact, belong to a species that is actually not technically obligate plantigrade. You're habitually plantigrade, but humans occasionally walk on their toes.
Right.
Now, if you found yourself in some environment where that became more and more advantageous, not just you, but a population of humans, for whatever reason, were in an environment where simply doing so was more and more advantageous, and those who could do so for more prolonged periods of time ended up simply having an easier time finding food and surviving. And of course, we're putting you in a survival situation. This is a situation where you can't just go
Right.
down to the local Walmart, right? Would it be
Right.
unreasonable to think that things like a lengthening of the metacarpals might occur and strengthening of the muscles that help keep the metacarpals angled down rather than having them rest on the ground over time? Does that seem unlikely?
That seems like something to me that might occur during one individual's life. If it was like if it experienced that type of pressure while it was live, it might develop that by the time it was
But you don't
aged.
but you
So
don't
then,
think genetic variation could cause the just natural default state of the foot to change?
um,
Because in order for that to be the
I
case,
find it unlikely.
so feet are immune to genetics.
Not immune to genetics. They're just more subject uh, to the instance, perhaps. I don't know.
Well, because the only way for genetic variation to not be able to vary the foot would be if the foot was somehow immune to genetics, which would then raise the question of how it is we can get different animal feet, because apparently feet are immune to genetics. So basically, by saying that feet can't change over time through descent with modification, we have to posit that somehow the phenotype is unrelated to the genotype just when it comes to feet. I don't know how you would argue that.
Right.
So
That
what?
I don't believe that's what I was saying exactly either.
But you said that
It
you don't believe that feet could change as a result of genetic variation and descent with modification.
what I'm
So
saying is that likely that would be more prone to an individual situation.
okay, but if a population is continually in this situation, wouldn't variations of the genotype that result in phenotypes affecting the foot that result in having that be an easier position to hold be favored?
If they were to come about, probably, yeah.
Okay, well, we know that mutations do in fact affect things like muscle size, strength, attachment point, length of bones, length of tendons, tendon strength, all these things, right? And that's all that's changing when you go from being habitually plantargrade to habitually digitigrade and then eventually obligate digitigrade. And so all that we need to do to get from plantargrade to digitigrade is see, is it advantageous to sometimes take a digitigrade stance? And the answer is, in the case of wolves who are primarily pursuit hunters, whereas bears, when they hunt, they tend to do more of an ambush thing. So wolves need some significant amount of speed over a higher distance for their hunting strategy. So as a result, digitigrade lengthens the digitigrade stance lengthens their stride length and increases to some extent the sort of springiness of their gait, allowing them to both move their limbs faster with less energy as well as cover larger distances for a given body size. So this increases their ability to be pursuit predators. So we know that many animals that are habitually plantargrade can adopt a digitigrade stance, and it seems like we don't have a good reason why a digitigrade stance can't be enhanced. So I don't see what the problem is from going from one to the other, which means at this point, unless you have a different argument for why that won't work, we have no anatomical reason to think that bears and dogs can't be related on the basis of inviolability of intermediates.
Right. So I'm not exactly uh, sure.
Well, see,
Oh,
I guess that brings up I suppose the problems that I find with because this is actually my second Old Earth creationist conversation talking about common ancestry and things like that. And the problem I find is that it seems like both of you, and I mean I'm I'm not trying to be mean or anything, but both of you have simply had what sounds like gut feelings about common ancestry that you couldn't actually justify on the basis of anything in particular. You couldn't point to anything that invalidates common ancestry between any two groups, or that would positively indicate that two groups had separate ancestry. And so it concerns me a little bit, because earlier, when you were talking about, say, the age of the universe, or the formation of Earth, or the age of the Earth, you said that you would simply default to the opinion of the experts. Well, the opinion of the experts is that all life so far studied on Earth has common ancestry with each other. And that consensus is no less strong than the consensus on the age of the Earth or the age of the universe. So, in order to reject that consensus, you need to have some kind of reason. And I'm not sure what that reason is.
Yeah. It would kind of be a completely different can of worms to open, but the major reason that I feel that these things are like that is from a my current investigation of the timelines and archaeology and a few things like that. It doesn't really, it's not really affected one way or the other. If there is common ancestry for the wolves or the bears, but I'm currently influenced to think that that's not as likely.
Okay, well, maybe let's go to an area where I'm pretty sure you're going to have a hard no. Humans and chimpanzees, or genus Pan more broadly. Common ancestry or no?
No.
Okay. Okay. Now, I'm assuming you're saying this primarily for theological reasons.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you earlier agreed that genuses Canis, Vulpes, Kuon, Lacaeon Pictus, and we didn't ask specifically about Urocyon, but I guess it doesn't matter that much, share common ancestry. But you are aware that that group is far more diverse than genus Homo plus genus Pan, right? There's more differences between wolves and dogs than there are between chimpanzees and humans.
Right.
So what prevents humans from being related to genus Pan?
I feel bad for doing this while Gutsick Gibbon is not able to defend it. But on one of the links that she gave for one of her most recent videos dealing with that subject, the paper actually stated that it was a, how do I say this? It was the genomes. They were redone because in previous attempts they had used the human reference primarily, and they built it off of that. And then afterwards, they didn't give any indication as to percentages or diversity between each other, and it currently is pretty blurry, at least from my standpoint, as to how they're actually claiming that they're currently related.
Well, let me give you some of the reasons why scientists would come to the conclusion that genus Homo and genus Pan share common ancestry. And we'll talk about sort of, because you wanted to go into the genome, we'll bring up the genetic reasons, right? So one of them is that you can do essentially an atlas of a genome, right? you can say, okay, what genes are there and where are they? Because all genes are going to be on a chromosome and they have a particular locus on the chromosome, right?
Right.
So human and chimpanzee, if you take an atlas, say, of their genes, nearly every single gene that they have, that they share, is in the same locus on the same chromosome. And the one big exception is that humans have one pair fewer chromosomes than chimpanzees do. But if you look at chimpanzee chromosomes 2A and 2B, if you were to, say, break the human chromosome 2 in half, then you would actually get that atlas of genes matching between those two. It's also the case that humans and chimpanzees share endogenous retroviruses, which is basically a virus which infected a germline cell in a previous organism, and as a result of mutations, became inactivated. And we can tell that they're viruses because they have things like reverse transcriptase genes. And the only organisms that need reverse transcriptase are viruses, because they need their RNA genomes to be converted into DNA in the host's genome in order to hitchhike as essentially a genetic parasite. So there's no reason for these things to exist except as viruses that are now broken. And so the chances of an ERV inserting at any particular point in the genome is essentially just 1 to the number of loci where insertion is possible, which is going to be billions. So when humans and chimpanzees share ERVs, if there isn't common ancestry, then whatever created both organisms just decided to give them fake inactive viruses in the exact same place, presumably to make it look like they shared a common ancestor. We also find things where the fusion site, or I suppose the alleged fusion site on human chromosome 2, it's exactly what you would expect from a fusion site between chromosomes that happened a few million years ago. So we have the telomeric repeats that occur in the middle. We have telomere-specific genes that occur around the fusion site. And we also have some degradation of the length of the fusion site, because since those telomeric repeats aren't useful there, they are free to mutate away from that sequence and not be selected against in that terms. And so we have a lot of reason to suspect, just based on the genome, whatever the final percentage number is. And scientists have gone away from using those numbers because they're not very rigorous. You can come up with a lot of ways that people find somewhat reasonable to say, oh, it's 98, or it's 99.2, or it's whatever. And because it depends on exactly how you measure it, because it's a little bit more complicated than just saying, oh, these two things are, 99% the same because we checked all 100 whatever bits and only one changed. The genome is a little bit more complicated than that. So, but all of the estimates that get thrown out are in the, 98, I'll say 97 plus range for genetic similarity. And we have those things that we can trace. We can say, okay, humans and chimpanzees share these ERVs with each other, but then they also have their own unique ERVs. They also share certain mutations with each other in other genes that, say, they don't share with gorillas, but then humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas also share ERVs and certain mutations with all within that group, but that they don't share with orangutans. And that whole group, humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, they share, again, certain mutations and certain ERVs and a certain amount of similarity, a high amount of similarity in that sort of atlas of the genome with the gibbons. And then again, you can take that whole group and you can say they share certain things with each other that they don't share with, say, the rest of Haplorhini, which is the dry-nosed primates, right? And so every time you take a step back, you see this nested hierarchy in the genome, but you can also see it in anatomy. So for instance, it's not just that the apes don't have a tail. They have their tail reduced into the coccyx in a particular way. It has a certain number of actual caudal vertebrae that it makes up. It attaches certain muscles in a particular way that does not occur in other animals, say, that don't have a tail, that have, or essentially have an internalized tail, which is more accurate to say about apes and humans. And we see certain similarities in, say, the hand structure. Ape hands, including human hands, are very strange compared to most mammal manuses or mani, Latin, whatever. So
Right.
those are some of the reasons why scientists would say that humans and Pan share common ancestry. Why do you think that they can't?
It's purely from an archaeological perspective that I don't see how they
Okay, well, what
like
archaeology?
like the actual like the actual supposed transition from ape to human. I
Mhm.
know that's not,
I'll allow
but
it.
the uh, the actual transition, as far as I can tell, is that's actually what my uh, illustration was going to point out. I was gonna.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry that the screen share isn't working well
It
from your
was
phone.
it was going to show the differences between uh, the chimpanzee morphologic uh, structure, primarily in the skull.
Hmm.
Between that, the Australopithecus, uh, the various Australopithecus species,
Okay.
and then up until Homo erectus, and then afterwards. And I was going to compare those uh,
So, what about those
together.
do you find problematic in terms of this being a record of morphological change? Why is that not what you're seeing there?
Well, and I really wish I had my illustration able to be up right now, but
If you can find
the
it online, I can make it so everyone can see it. But don't exhaust yourself doing that, because I think everyone here
okay,
has seen these skulls, even on my videos. So,
right.
and if you
So
haven't, go check out more of my videos.
exactly, watch more Dapper Dino.
Yes, thank you. So, yeah, what is it? Because I'll be honest, when I look at a series of skulls going arranged, so that in one direction is essentially the timeline direction, I see an extremely smooth gradient from an organism that has a skull that is very similar to a modern chimpanzee to an organism that has a skull that is, in fact, a modern human skull. And I don't see where that breakdown occurs. Everything that I see there, every little, from one, I don't want to say step because it's not technically accurate, but from one skull to the next, when we arrange them, in that timeline, all of the changes that I see between those two skulls look like they're within the variation that I would expect from just ordinary variability in an organism's genome, because as we know, the genome affects the genotype affects the phenotype. So, what prevents this from being an actual evolutionary sequence?
Well, from this, I used a graph where basically there's a line where the uh, where the top and the bottom of the eye is, where the bottom of the maxillary is, and at the top of the skull case,
Mm-hmm.
and then I compare, which of course I could be wrong on this. In a picture, it's a little bit difficult to tell, but I try to align oh, I lost it.
So it's basically the height of the face.
The height of the face, the width of the skull. It's not just the face, but it's the skull in relation to it and the relative brain size. And from what I could find out, the all of the Australopithecus species up until like Homo erectus is like the transition between when you start seeing Australopithecus or Homo
Right.
uh, type things, and the relative brain size of uh, those on one side or the other uh, match either the Australopithecus or the Homo. Uh,
Oh, okay. But
comparison best.
okay, but going to habilis is a bit late. If you were to say take Homo erectus, you'll see that it generally has a significantly smaller brain case size than Homo habilis. And well, if I believe, and of course Erica will kill me if I get this wrong. So, and there's a fair chance that this might be my last live stream ever because she's going to come and get me. But I believe it's Homo sediba, which actually currently has some debate as to whether or not it should be, in fact, reassigned to Australopithecus because, among other things, it has a brain case size that is at the extreme low end for what is considered valid for genus Homo. And also, have you ever seen? Have you seen Futurama?
Not much.
Okay. Well, did you see the episode A Clockwork Origin?
Probably not.
Well, there's this. It's a very good episode, and I recommend it to everyone. Go see. The habilis skull is smaller than erectus. I got it wrong. You know what? I'm always screwing this up. Anyway, so it has this scene where someone is arguing against human evolution from apes, and they have a display saying, "Oh, you've never found this so-called missing link between ape and human." And Professor Farns, oh, it's Homo sediba. Yep, it was Homo sediba. Sorry about that. It's Australopithecus sediba, not Homo sediba. Yeah, see, that's the thing. There's a debate there. Anyway, sorry. And so the Professor Farnsworth says, yes, we have, and then he names, I think it was like Homo erectus or something. And the character arguing against this says, aha, but you found the link between this so-called ape and this and this Homo erectus? And he says, we did, and he names another species. And then, of course, there's a little fade transition, so we can say it's now it's nighttime, and they've continued to argue. And there's this list of like 13 or so species. And the character arguing against human evolution says, I have you now. Have you found the link between this and whatever is there? And the professor says, right. Okay, no, we haven't found that one link. I will grant you. And so this is a thing that it feels like that's what's happening here, where you're saying we have all of these things that are morphologically intermediary between basal great apes and modern humans. But because there isn't one that fits neatly into one little gap there, that for you means that gap can't be bridged. I don't see why that is a logically consistent reason to reject the common ancestry. It's sort of like saying, okay, I have a 100-piece puzzle. 16 pieces are missing. So the puzzle probably isn't really a puzzle, it's just nothing. It's like, yeah, but I can fit everything else together. There might be a piece here or there that I'm not sure where it goes, but like, I can tell what the puzzle's supposed to be. Like, I can tell that there are missing pieces, and it seems to me like that's kind of what we're doing here. We're saying, okay, because Australopithecus groups cluster a bit, and because Homo groups cluster a bit, even though the clusters are close to each other, and there's a definite trend over time, we need something that has to fit this particular gap or it doesn't count.
That's not exactly my my personal opinion.
Well, then why does it matter that the skull morphology for Australopithecus and Homo cluster?
Up until this point, if you're looking at it from a directly, like how many cubic centimeters fits in its skull, it does follow this trend. But if you actually put it out on a graph, everything from this area falls not just generally, but nearly perfectly into this one grouping.
Okay, but that again, that's the data clustering. That's literally what data clustering is. You get two clusters of data, but the thing is that there are two groups of fossil organisms that cluster in certain metrics doesn't mean that you can't move from one to the other. Like, is it your contention that brain case size can't change on the basis of genetics?
As far as relative brain case size, it just and I'm not trying to be problematic here. It's just the progression seen is a purely uh, is it metric? Is that the word? And not a relative thing. The transitional forms they look right because they are that size in this size, but they're not actually relatively different from the other,
So
except for
are you
at
saying
one
that
point.
the skulls are scaled so that they are roughly all the same size in the pictures?
No, it's just that the gradient that a person may be looking at, as far as the ratio of how wide to how tall uh, a skull is,
Okay.
just because one is a little bit longer than the other doesn't mean that it's transitioning into something else. It's just
I agree that by itself it doesn't mean that. But okay, let me kind of step back as to the order of how this human ancestry from within apes came about as an idea. So first we go all the way back to Linnaeus, right? Linnaeus was a creationist, and he actually was a proponent largely of species fixity. He actually didn't think speciation could occur. But he recognized that organisms were clustered into larger categories. And so he actually did think that humans were a part of the ape category. And in fact, at one point, he considered putting at least one other ape species in the same genus as Homo sapiens. I don't remember which one it was, but it was he seriously considered it. He ended up not doing so, and in fact putting humans outside the ape family, simply because he basically didn't want to get theologians mad at him. So he erected an extra family called Pongidae, which actually was still current when I was a kid. People were still talking about Pongidae as a family. And Hominidae...
they still do.
Well, you get that in a few creationist areas. Most of the actual professional taxonomy going on has gotten rid of Pongidae. But anyway,
Right.
so Linnaeus is the first person to recognize that at a fundamental morphological level, humans are apes, or apes are human. They're the same category. They can't legitimately be separated from the rest of the apes in terms of taxonomy. Okay, well, then at around the time when Darwin is, doing things like writing The Descent of Man, the fact that, or because the idea of common descent is now becoming more and more widely accepted, the obvious conclusion was that this nested hierarchy that we can see in nature that Linnaeus discovered is explained by common descent. And so if the nested hierarchy is the result of common descent, which is explained by evolution, then if you want to find what something evolved from, you look at the categories into which it falls. So if humans are inside the ape category, then that would mean that all the apes would share a common ancestor. And so the ancestor of, say, humans and any other ape would have been some kind of thing that you would recognize as an ape if you looked at it. Okay. So then there were a couple competing hypotheses as to exactly where humans evolved and which other organisms were their closest relatives. Now you gotta remember, a lot of this was happening before the genome was sequenced and before we could do easy genetic similarity tests. We could do crude ones, which involved basically heating up some DNA, making it fuse together, and then heating it up again and waiting to see how long it would take for it to break apart, and that gave you a rough idea of similarity. And that works because the more closely related two things, or the closer the genomes are of two organisms, the more those DNA strands will be able to find matching base pairs on the other side of the other DNA strand, so the more closely they can bind. And so the energy that it takes to unbind them is going to be roughly related to how similar those two genomes are. Anyway, so we could do that, but it was pretty vague in that kind of, as a way of measuring genetic similarity. So then there were a number of hypotheses put forward as to what morphology we should expect for human ancestors, and when we should expect to find them in terms of the timeline, which then correlates to where in the stratigraphic column, which then you go and look at a geological survey, of the area to find out where such rocks can be accessed. And then when people went digging, they found things that matched the predictions for what the morphology of an expected human ancestor would look like. So this is one of those areas where evolution is making predictions the whole way down, and they're being verified. Now, granted, there were sometimes competing evolutionary hypotheses, but the hypothesis that you would get from, say, species fixity, or even non-common ancestry from humans to other apes, is that there's no reason to expect to find anywhere organisms which are morphologically intermediate between a basal ape anatomy and the significantly derived modern human anatomy. So it's not just that these organisms were found in about the place and time where we expected them to be found. You add that to the genetic information that we also went over, where we have things like shared ERVs, shared mutations, we have shared pseudogenes, which are genes that got broken, basically. The gene doesn't work anymore, but we still got it. And we've got pseudogenes that are broken in the same way in chimpanzees and humans. The exact same mutation that breaks the gene, it breaks it in both of us. No, both of you, sorry. Right. So it seems to me like this is exactly what you would want to see if you said, okay, my hypothesis is that humans and chimpanzees shared a common ancestor. What should I expect to see? It's exactly what you do see. And pointing out that fossil hominids cluster in terms of certain measures of anatomy doesn't really negate that. I don't see why that is a defeater for that. All that means is that there's probably some fossil hominid, or in fact hominin, and organisms that aren't well represented in the current fossil record, which isn't really a problem per se, it's just an inconvenience.
Right.
So what in your mind overcomes all of that?
It's, again, a completely different can of worms as far as the archaeology goes. It's kind of influenced my thinking in this particular area, but the fact that, at least from my analysis, that the Australopithecus relative brain size was the same as soon as you could find anything called an Australopithecus, which we call it, of course, sorry, up until this point where it's supposedly transitional, and if they all have the same relative brain size, then I personally find it.
So your contention is that all members of Australopithecus have the same brain size?
Relatively, yes.
Okay, well let's check on that. So there is a convenient measure of brain to body size called the encephalization quotient, right? So let's take a look at Australopithecines and whatnot. So let's see. Okay. Trying to see if I can get just a list of the numbers. Oh, come on. I just want the numbers, guys. All right. So let's see. So we get 3.2 for most great apes, the average for most great apes. We get 8.8 for Homo sapiens. We're also getting 3.9 for Australopithecines as the average, but I'm not seeing anything that lists all of them. Let's see. Okay, so I'm now I can't exactly vouch for all of this because I don't really have the time right now to dig through every bit of literature, but what I'm seeing right now for approximate EQ for Australopithecus afarensis is 2.2, and then for Australopithecus africanus it's 2.5, which is an increase. And that is an increase in encephalization quotient, which means relative brain size to body mass going forward in time. And then we go up to Homo habilis and we get 4.3. And then we go to Homo erectus and we get 5. And we go to Homo sapiens, we get 7 for archaic Homo sapiens. And then for more anatomically modern Homo sapiens, we get 7.44, which can go up all the way up to 8.8 in certain individuals. While it is not an indication, it's not a direct indication of intelligence in humans, the exact number of encephalization quotient, it actually only very loosely correlates. Certain groups of humans do actually have higher encephalization quotients. So, yeah, I am not seeing anything saying that the encephalization quotient, which is essentially what we're talking about here, is going to be the same for all Australopithecines. But we could say that there is a bit of a jump between Homo habilis, between Australopithecus africanus and Homo habilis. But again, that just sounds like you're saying, but you haven't found that one missing link. Where's the 3.2 EQ hominin? And I can just say, I don't have one at hand, but that isn't a problem. Like, I didn't have any of them up until like the 60s.
Right.
that they weren't found up until that point doesn't mean they didn't exist, and it doesn't mean that they're not viable intermediaries between more basal apes and humans. So I don't understand why the fact that there's a bit of a clustering. In fact, if you notice, there's not much clustering in Homo. Once you get to genus Homo, the clustering starts to turn into... Oh. Cain, you still there? You with us?
Should be.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. So, what I was
call come in for a second.
Well, what I was saying is that when we get to Homo, we actually don't see clustering. We actually see a fairly smooth progression upward in EQ through time. And with Australopithecus, we actually do see a small increase over time. And the fact that there isn't a species that has an EQ that's right in the middle between, say, Homo habilis and any one Australopithecus species doesn't seem to me like a huge problem, because, like I said, we didn't have any of these hominin fossils up until a few decades ago, but that didn't mean that they didn't exist and that human evolution from apes was less likely. So it still seems to me like what you're saying is, you don't have this one fossil form that I would like to see. But so what? Why does that overcome all the other information?
I completely understand that. But the problem I particularly see is in the relative brain size as far as the actual measurement, is that there's different relative bone densities and other tissues being estimated before the actual calculation is made, which just leaves it open for some problems.
So
the prediction that Australopithecus would be found is, I completely accept that, but it's
I guess I'm having trouble understanding what the argument is, because what I'm hearing when I try to parse it down and break down what you're trying to say here is, what I hear you trying to say is that there is variation in bone density and, I suppose, muscle mass between various hominin species. Well, right, they're different species. There are variation in bone density and muscle mass and relative bone sizes, relative brain case sizes between, say, the members of genus Canis, which we've already discussed, right? Like, the EQ of the, say, Canis lupus is not even the same as the average encephalization quotient for Canis lupus domesticus or Canis lupus dingo. And it, again, varies between, say, Canis lupus and Canis latrans or Canis aureus or Canis rufus. Like, all of these things vary. Why is it a problem for humans when it's not a problem for canines?
well, I mean, I personally haven't done any measurements on canines in particular to come up with any theories for that. So it's, as far as I can tell, it's a pretty unresearched area too, as far as like trying to find a kind by those means per se.
So, okay. Maybe I'll... Okay, so I think we can both agree that... We both agree that genotype affects phenotype. Right? What's in your genes is going to affect how your body is put together and shaped and whatnot, right? So, let's say we take all the canine species that you've agreed shared common ancestry, right? And we scaled their skeletons on a graph so that they all had, say, equal femur length. That's a common way to scale animals to show difference in like an anatomical scale of like proportionality, right? You scale them so they have equal femur length. So now we have pictures of, say, the skeletons of all...
Are you still on? I didn't hear.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I am still here. It looks like our connection is getting a little weak. So let's say I take all of the canines that you've agreed were related, right? And I scale diagrams of their skeletons so that each skeleton has an equal femur length. Do you think that all of the bones in all of these organisms would have the same size and shape after I do that?
Something's wrong.
Oh, can you not hear me? I think maybe it's my mic. Hello? Nope, mic check looks good. Cain, can you hear me?
Let's see.
I'm going to tell Cain to try disconnecting and reconnecting. I'm going to tell him that in our internal chat. Maybe that'll fix it. Technical difficulties are always the worst. That is why I always recommend, if possible, get a hardwired connection to a modem, use a PC. Also, if someone could put in the chat to have them try connecting and... actually, I'll just do it. I can type in the chat. Hopefully we get Cain back here. We'll see if he can rejoin in the next, say, I don't know, 8 or so minutes. Oh, and there he is. Got Cain back. Cain, do you hear? Can you hear me?
Can hear you.
Okay, awesome. All right, so what I was saying is, let's say we did an exercise, right, where we took all the canines that you said were related. So we took some foxes and some dholes and some wolves and jackals and all that, right? And we scaled all their skeletons on a diagram so that they had the same femur length. So that way it's easy to compare their proportions. Would the proportions be the same for all those animals?
No, probably not.
I can guarantee you they wouldn't
I
be.
personally would say probably not even within a kind.
Okay.
Just because of the physical differences required for just being larger is one variable, and then there's multiple other variables.
Well, and you're also aware that things like certain breeds of dogs are smarter than others? Like, for instance, the Afghan Hound is notoriously stupid, whereas the Border Collie is notoriously intelligent. It's not I didn't make it up. But, so, do you think that could be reflected in relative brain case size? Because I can tell you for a fact that among domesticated dogs, relative brain case sizes do vary. Not all dogs have the same, not all canines have the same encephalization quotient. So this is within a species. Now, granted, it's an absurdly variable species. Dogs are on extreme outliers for variation. But my point is just that everything that you're pointing out about the variation in anatomy in hominins is a smaller concern, with the one exception of the expanding brain case. It's a smaller amount of variation than you're seeing in just canines. And if the objection is just the brain case, then we have to come up again with why can't changes in genetics affect the brain case? And if it can't, why is it that humans heritably have gigantic brain cases? Because if it's not genetic, it's got to be something else. Are there angels with blowing up babies' heads like balloons inside of human wombs? If it's not genetics, it's got to be something else. And if it is genetics, why can't that be something that is the result of descent with modification?
Well, it is genetics, and I'm not saying that it can't be subject to modifications.
Okay.
Just the modifications would likely not be viable.
Why is that?
In particular to the brain. There's particular areas where if you modify a certain part, the whole organism is rendered useless.
Right, but the parts of the brain of a human aren't different than the parts of the brain of even a mouse. Every part of that your brain has, a mouse has. The main difference is that a mouse has much smaller ones compared to its body size. So it has a cerebellum, which is where most of the human cognition goes on, right? It has a brainstem. It has all the same lobes as a human brain does, and it's even more similar with a chimpanzee and a human. And there's no one who's proposing that a new part of the brain was simply formed or that an old part went away. And we know that organisms that are related can have different relative sizes of certain parts of the brain. So What is it about going from an Australopithecus 2.2-ish encephalization quotient to like a 7.5 on a modern human? Where does that break happen? What causes there to be a problem?
Well, there's just quite a number of things that change at the exact same time.
Right.
When you're looking at it, how they present it, it's a nice gradient, but and of course I could be totally wrong with my measurements, but according to them, there's a certain number of characteristics that are just suddenly there that weren't there before, and it's pretty much everything that that actually separates humans from Australopithecus.
So what is suddenly there? Could you name one thing that is suddenly there that doesn't have any kind of antecedent?
Well, for instance, the structure of the face, the relative. I'm going to butcher this word. Prognathism.
I believe that's about right. Then prognathism. I think. Yeah, that should be right.
It is relatively the same from one end to the other end, and there's then there's the for instance the bony nose bridge, which is another thing that sticks out further on the top half of the face, and then not that a brow ridge is anything that's unique to either genre, but there's just something different about it, and this is only in a comparison of skulls, not of skull to body ratios, but relatively to each other. These skulls have a very different composition.
Okay.
That's actually the image that I was going to use to illustrate it.
Good. So here's my thing, right? So prognathism can be seen on the bottom so we've got 2 rows of 2 rows. So row, if you want to go 1, 2, 3, 4. So the even number rows, so the second row and the fourth row, right? We get a profile view of the skulls that are scaled to be roughly the same scale to account for the fact that some of them are just overall bigger, but that's not relative scale, right? So proportionally,
Right.
we're scaling them. And the problem is that there is decreasing prognathism going from A to B, from B to C, from C to D, all the way down. Basically, until you get to about somewhere around, say, L, the prognathism is basically at a minimum, and it doesn't really change from that point on because the face is essentially flat. Which one of those is the impossible leap?
It's actually from G to H.
Why is that?
Well, I mean, and I really feel bad for doing this without my illustration. It would be a lot easier for me to show you, but
Okay.
there's from the one to the other, there's many differences morphologically that are just suddenly there.
All right, well, I'll tell you what. It is a little bit difficult to see, primarily because this is a what do you call it? This is they're on two different levels. So here's what I'm going to do. I am going to give me just a second, just to make sure that we don't have any. Yeah, so I'm just going to turn off the video feed for just a second for everyone else. Sorry about that. I'm going to open up an image editor. And we're gonna grab them and put them next to each other, and we're gonna see what the problems are. Does that seem like a good idea?
Okay.
So let's see. So I've got this open in an image editor. I'm gonna put it on my other display, and that means, by the way, for a little bit, chat, I'm not gonna be able to see you clearly. So sorry about that, but you know, that's what happens. All right, so I'm gonna stop screen share on that, and I'm gonna screen share a different window. We're gonna screen share this. Okay. And then I'm going to turn back on my video. So now we can see that I am editing this photo here, right? So basically what we need to do is we just basically need to grab H and put it next to G. So I'm going to copy this whole thing, select none, drag it over a little bit just so they're still going in the same direction. And then I'm going to, I'm going to say, let's see, which side, there we go. Now I can do it. Okay. So here we are, nice and zoomed in. Okay, I want to know which parts of this are now beyond the realm of possibility.
So it's a little bit difficult without the graph, but for instance, the let's see, it's a little bit small on my screen here. So like, let's.
Also, after this, I'm going to be opening it up to questions. So if you have questions, get them ready. Questions can be addressed to me or Cain. And again, super chat questions get to the top of that list, and I try to go through them more or less in the order they're given, except that super chat questions go first. So sorry about that. Just want to make that, because we're at the almost hour 40 mark, so we're actually going to end up having a fairly short Q&A session. So, but what about, because here's what I'm seeing about this is I'm seeing a bit of a change in the brow ridge, where the brow ridge has become a bit more prominent, and the front of the maxilla gets pushed back a little bit farther, and also maybe narrows a bit. I don't know why none of those things can be the result of mutations to the genes that control skull shape.
Right. Well, Um, I'm getting a bunch of calls and people are wondering where I am, but the those things are not. I'm not saying that they're impossible to change via genetics, but we just don't see them change. I don't know. I imagine Gutsick Gibbon will be contacting us shortly, and perhaps we could do a Zoom meeting
I actually,
with her,
well,
and I'll be able to share my screen.
I would be very open to doing a Zoom meeting with her. I will let her know. I don't know if she'll see this, but I will let her know that you're interested, and we could certainly go through a lot of that. I'm just gonna, as my final point, say we know that genotype affects phenotype. We know that these two phenotypes are the result of differences in genotypes. I would need a good solid reason why mutations couldn't go from G to H. I don't see any, and in the absence of a good reason why they couldn't, the evidence for common ancestry from both anatomy and even more importantly from genetics stands as far as I'm concerned. Although you're welcome not to agree with me, but now I am going to open it up to questions, and I'm going to see if we have any. Gutsick Gibbon has put out a hit on Dapper Dino for his error. Yeah, Monk Mayfair. That's probably true, actually. Sorry, guys. I'll try to make sure that I get my next premiere scheduled so that it can come out posthumously after Gutsick Gibbon has me killed off. So let's see. Let's see. That was less of a question and more of an incredulous response from an intrigued feline. So yeah. So feel free to ask any questions. While I'm waiting for a few questions to come in, I will remind everyone that we are getting the next Saturday's video is going to be a premiere. I'll just show you the thumbnail. There's the thumbnail I made. Very, very nice. I don't know. I like it. I think it's cute. So that's going to be Saturday. That should be at 11:30. I'm pushing it back a little bit so as to not overlap with some other channels. And oh, it looks like Cain can't actually stick around for Q&A. So I will probably just see if there's any last chats that I feel like need to be read out loud or questions for me, and then we will simply shut it down. Let's see. Why does the volume of the brain case gradually increase in overlap between habilis erectus, Homo sapiens? Sorry, that was probably for Cain. I mean, obviously for me, I'm going to say, well, it's because that is, in fact, morphological intermediaries indicative of a sequence of ancestry. So there you go. There are no genetics available for these species, but there is between Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens, and they're even more similar. It even shows sapiens outside of. Yeah, it's true. So it's very frustrating when and I'm not saying this because I don't like Cain Wilson. Cain Wilson seems like a great guy, and I would be happy to have him on for a discussion with Erica on her channel or my channel. So yeah, we don't have the genetics available for, say, Australopithecus or even the earlier Homo species, but we do for later Homo species, and we do for genus Pan as well as genus Gorilla and genus Pongo. I mean the orangutans. So when you look at the genetics and they fall into a clearly nested hierarchy where there are shared inherited mutations between them, and then you look and we find predicted intermediary forms in the fossil record, it just baffles me when the answer just comes back as basically an argument from incredulity. Does Dapper Dino sleep in a hat? No, I take the hat off for this, as well as sometimes for playing games on my other channel, Top Hat's Off. Oh, Ken Hoven's employee, the notifications aren't going out? So, okay, I want to say this might actually be partially my fault. I originally forgot to set the correct time for the stream, so I set the stream up last night at around 7 p.m., and I changed the date, but I forgot to change the time, and so it just defaulted to a 10 p.m., And then originally that was the time that was listed on this, and I only changed it this morning when I noticed. There you go. Let's see. Is intelligent design this? Is intelligent design thing is real? And if not, what are the evidence? I think you're asking if intelligent design is real, and if it is, what's the evidence? And I've actually asked that to the last Old Earth creationist that I had on, Dark Knight Apologetics. And unfortunately, he didn't have any forthcoming answer as to what we would need to look for in order to say that something had been intelligently designed in biology. So, let's see. Verlinson, Cain sounds good, just lacking. He sounds like someone who looks at something and draws his own understanding from it without the training or knowledge. I think that's probably the case, but that's also true for a lot of people. And I mean, hey, look, I just display that I'm far from an expert on human evolution, but it still bugs me that creationists will look at groups of organisms that are far more diverse than hominidae and say, oh yeah, that's probably a genetically related group of animals. And then they'll look at hominidae, or even, you know, just genus Pan and Homo, who are extremely similar, and they'll just say, nah, that's not a thing. But anyway, I think I'm going to call it here. It's a little bit, I mean, we're not very early. We're at an hour 46 in. So thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you especially to Scott Duke and Eric Virataler92, who provided their generous super chats. I'm sorry that Cain had to cut it a little bit short, but hopefully we can actually set something up later with Erica, and we can, all three of us, have a discussion about human ancestry, evolution, common ancestry, all that. And hey, maybe someday we will get a anti-evolutionist who can come on and tell us how they know two things aren't related in a way that isn't inherently contradictory. But there you go. Jump into prison Mike after the stream. I might TD Lane. That's a reference to a Discord server. But all right, thank you very much, everyone. I hope I see you on Saturday for Things That Aren't Dinosaurs 5 Turtles. See you later.